Hello and welcome to the MIT System Design and Management Program's Systems Thinking webinar series. My name is Lois Slavin. I'm the SDM Communications Director, and we're thrilled to have all of you. This webinar has set a record for attendees, and we're really happy to have folks from around the world, from across many different disciplines. The title for this webinar, as you know, is Systems Architecture for Corporate Innovation, How to Run a Successful Initiative and Deliver Tangible Results. We are thrilled to welcome Mona Vernon, an SDM alumnus and Vice President from Thomson Reuters. And with that, I turn it over to Mona.
Thanks, Lois. It's really exciting to be back on campus to do this webinar. So thank you for attending. I'm going to go through an agenda here briefly. There we go. So really, I want to start with the motivation for this talk and describe a little bit why I thought it was an interesting topic to share with the rest of you. It will follow with some insights that I've gathered in the process of building a corporate innovation program in my current employers, Thomson Reuters, and some of these insights might be helpful if you're in the process of building your own initiative or planning to do that. And then I'm going to link that to some of the concepts in system architecture, which is part of the core teaching in the System and Design and Management program, and go briefly touch on a couple of useful tools for your consideration around lean startup and open innovation, and then we'll open it up to the question and answers and hope to make that session quite interactive. Okay, So what's the motivation? Corporate innovation is not new, but the market conditions are different because of the pace of technological innovation. So I'm going to share with you this little chart looking specifically in my industry in information services and information technology and companies that are traditionally more IT information technology intensive. So you'll see in this chart by Andy McAfee and Eric Brynjolfsson from Sloan that as you look at the ranking of the top selling firm in IT, you'll see a significant increase in turbulence, meaning that the people that were in the top ranking position, for instance, have a harder time holding their spot. And this increased turbulence in the marketplace has some significant consequences, which are that innovation is no longer the business solely of the research and development groups or labs in large companies. Innovation is becoming a priority for the CEOs. And so consequently, what you're seeing is that there is a surge in the desire and need to start innovation initiatives. And those are driven by the executive leadership. So because the market conditions are more turbulent, because there is a higher pace of innovation in technology, there is an increased need in figuring out how to innovate, and that is actually driven all the way from the top. So I'm going to go through a definition which I like very much. This is from a friend and mentor, Dr. Erwin Wlodowski-Berger, and Dr. Wlodowski-Berger has a really nice definition here, which oops, sorry, I ended up walking out of the, oops, I don't know how to get out of this mode. Let's see. Sorry about that. So the definition here, I like it a lot because it captures the recent historical context in which innovation has become a real and urgent priority for the CEOs and no longer, as I said, just the sole responsibility of the R&D labs. And I think this definition captures the fact that innovation is a response to this historical change. And it also correctly defines innovation not as an end goal, but as a means to achieve an end goal. And so that end goal, for instance, could be delivering better customer value, having a significant impact on the existing market, meaning taking a leadership position, or how to enter and penetrate new markets. So this is all great. Unfortunately, most corporate innovation initiatives fail. And this fact is little discussed or understood, yet many companies continue and have to launch new initiatives. So here's some anecdotal evidence of this failure, and actually some interesting facts around it. So in 2006, a study showed that the average tenure of a chief innovation officer was about 2 years. And I think when you look at this statement by Clay Christensen, which is quite staggering, that most of these innovation initiatives are wasting the time of companies and that they're failing, you know, then you contrast that by the CEO of a startup called Box that's sort of trying to penetrate the enterprise market, that something is not working, and so that's the advantage for new entrants. It really shows a side that's not often talked about. And so I think success stories are the byproduct of a sampling bias, of the caveman effect. So, you know, prehistoric people were associated with caves because that's where the data still exists about them, but that doesn't necessarily mean they lived in caves for most of their lives. It's the same with innovation initiatives. What we often hear are the great success stories, how they work out fantastically, and they're touted by the people that are putting their best foot forward, and I think it's a sampling bias. And I agree with Clay that they tend to all often be difficult to achieve some measurable and tangible outcomes. So this is really the motivation in connecting with you and talking about this, is to try to unravel a little bit of the data that's not often visible, and beyond the success stories that are underpinning the desire for some consulting companies to help you with your innovation program, or the stories told by former chief innovation officers. There is some data that I managed to collect by talking to people in those functions, behind closed door, off the record, that might be helpful. And I've tried to connect those with some of the principles that I found useful when applying system architecture to the process of setting up a new initiative. So I think one of the most common things that I've noticed is, and this is again starting a section around data-driven insights on the strength and weakness of common innovation approaches or tools, is this process of decomposition without architecture. So let me talk to you about what I mean here. When faced with starting a new innovation initiative, what I often see happen is what I call a decomposition without architecture. And so here's a framework, like many of them. This one is quite popular, actually. It's the Dublin 10 Types of Innovation. And you can see that this concept of innovation is here decomposed into 10 components. So I think the heuristic that I wanted to share here is that if you're choosing a framework or building an innovation toolbox, you are performing a decomposition. And for one of the things we learn in system architecture is that decomposition is an explicit choice, and it's one of the highest leverage decisions an architect makes. And this is important because decomposition impacts performance, how performance is measured, how the organization should be set up. And decomposition requires understanding the goals, the boundaries, and the implications of the chosen tools, because one of the things that it needs to take into account is emergent behaviors from those decisions. And so decomposition being an active choice by the architect, let's say the innovation lead will consider myself here as an architect, it has significant implications. So when one decides to adopt one framework, like the very common framework being this one, for instance, there is a decision made, albeit implicit, that we've made a decomposition, that our approach to innovation will follow a structure, and here's one, for example. So here's another one that's actually quite common, is to think about allocation of resources and funding with this portfolio model. I think this might have come from, my understanding is this is something that came out of Google, and it's this idea basically that you'll invest 70% of your innovation budget in core, or your core business. On the other spectrum, you're going to spend 10% of your budget on transformative innovations. And the assumption here is that, I think implicit, so let's talk about what this means as a decomposition model. I think the assumption is that somehow innovations are autonomous and that can be pursued independently. So I'm putting some funding around innovation in my core, but I'm going to put some around transformational, and those are very different buckets. Maybe they're managed by different people. They have very different outcome, as a matter of fact, and there's a sort of this heuristic that 10% transformative investment might result in 70%. And I actually haven't been able to find any validation of the fact that this model actually produces the returns that are touted. I don't know how that would happen, but I'd be really keen to hear maybe from this audience if you see your 10% transformative innovation budget actually results in 70% return. It certainly doesn't seem to be still the case in the people that developed this model. And I think the danger, for instance, with this type of decomposition is it has some assumption about the autonomy of the type of activities in each sector. And I will talk a little bit about a different lens than one might take. But certainly, I think there is some assumption made the minute you decide that this is sort of the structure you're looking at for your innovation approach. And I'm going to use one more example, and this is again to continue with this idea that there is some data that came out of many conversations with people in innovation leadership role across several industries with a focus in technology, in finance, in publishing, in media. And it was really staggering that behind, sort of off the record, there were some recurrent themes that would emerge. But those themes are really hard to see when you go and look at sort of best practices of innovation you might read in the Harvard Business Review or some of the models that are presented to you. As a matter of fact, this model used to be the model, I found this model well documented by the Monitor Group, which is no longer in business, but was really shown as a mechanism for a large company to think about their innovation management. When you talk to people in the roles and accountable for innovation, there are things they'll talk about publicly, and there are things that actually are more of their experience. And I want to share one with you. That's, I think, something that is a recurrent and very challenging initiative that companies want to take on, and it's about engaging their employees around the innovation process. And over and over, we'll see the same behavior, and it wouldn't be MIT if I didn't show some kind of causal loop diagram. So here's mine, and I want to walk you through this. So oftentimes you'll hear this idea of running an innovation idea fest or an idea jam, or getting all the ideas from the employees and collecting them all, because in some sense there is some implicit equation between getting and collecting the ideas from the employees to innovating. So let me give you some data point before I walk through what that little causal loop diagram is intending to convey, which is sort of what I observed by talking to people and actually through our own experience. IBM launched an Idea Jam in 2006. This is a really broad-scale engagement of 150,000 employees globally. It was supported from the very top, which is great. And it actually went hand in hand with a $100 million investment from the CEO for the top 10 ideas, okay? So this was something that was really high promise, high leverage, and I think it achieved one thing. It did achieve in engaging multiple stakeholders and engaging the employees. And that model then translates in something that other companies want to emulate, because IBM, and actually they sell this as a software and a service, IBM, and many other companies, and there is a myriad of collaboration innovation tools that are sold to the enterprise, to the point that some of the tool reviews and market reviews like Forrester and Gartner will give you like a whole spectrum of which vendors can you use for your idea management or innovation or collaboration tools, and depending on how you call those things. So let's look at this. So if you just look at the public data from the IBM Idea Jam, that investment of $100 million today is presented as having resulted in $700 million, which is 0.7% of the total revenue for IBM. Now, that might be a good output, but I think there is an implicit belief that by putting not only energy and significant funding, here in the case of $100 million, you might get more than 0.7% move in your total revenue. And those numbers are actually good to understand because it helps you frame what you should expect from an initiative like this. If you want to get your employees engaged, there are things you need to think about. And what I want to talk about in this little diagram is what could happen if you don't set the expectation well. So, you start with an initiative. I'm going to ask my employees for their input, and everybody should participate. And you actually, the first time around, the employees are going to really care and get involved and submit to your call for actions. So you collect a large input from the employees, and without much more structure or thinking, those ideas will be really all over the place. You might even ask, how do I get increased revenue, or how do I better serve my customer? But it's such an open-ended question that the answer is really a reflection of the context around each employee, and they'll give you an idea for which you'll miss that context, but you'll get a lot of information, okay? Now, we know that even in the best cases, implementation rates are always very small, and you can see, for instance, either explicitly, like with the IBM Idea Jam, only 10 top ideas were implemented, or even in the context of screening them and judging them, you'll end up with a small fraction that's selected, and even a smaller fraction that is actually executed upon. So time goes by. It's really hard to measure the results from that initiative for various reasons, because there is delays in how an idea can be executed. You'll actually hit some role. The actual challenge oftentimes is downstream from the idea. And we have observed that you end up in two negative unintended consequences. One is you lose enthusiasm for the initiative, and you somehow disenfranchise the employee, which I think is the worst outcome. Where you went and solicited for their input, if you can't give them enough of a well-defined, well-bounded problem statement, then their ideas are good, but they were answering too broad of a call. And you might actually see the initiative either be put on life support, which it often happens, and you hear comments like, oh, we use this, innovation idea management tool, but the value we get from it is quite incremental, and in quote, one case, it's good for finding a better screw size for my, core team, for instance, or yes, it's nice, and we keep running it because it's a way to continue with a real it's a mechanism for employee engagement, but I'm not really getting value from it. And this is not one or two comments. I've heard this to the point now that it becomes a very recurrent story if it's done with a very broad and open-ended call. And so typically what happens is there's a management change, there's a renewed call for innovation, a new initiative is launched, and we'll start that cycle again. And you might find in your organization that that might have happened if there is enough of a corporate memory to tell the story, or there's a way to avoid that cycle. So what innovation is not is unfocused, open-ended ideation. It's not 10% of time, and it's not running open-ended innovation events, especially if you really have a high stake for a return on the time you're getting invested from your employees, and you're trying to get some very focused outcome, for instance, better organic growth, cost saving, whatever it might be that is actually measurable. So one of the ways you might break that cycle is when you're running an idea fest, you understand the limitation of the approach, and that it's probably best suited for something that's quite well-bounded, autonomous type of innovation you might want without too much interdependency. And it's best suited for some incremental improvements that you're looking to achieve, and those are quite valid, but that's what it's best suited for. And I think for me, the biggest risk in hearing the stories from all these innovation leaders as I was setting up my program is the real risk of disenfranchising the employees. And so you have to manage their expectation well. What is going to be your implementation rate? What is a realistic implementation rate? What's the best of breed implementation rate in industry? And so the other way to do this is to be really clear on a problem statement. And the more work you do up front to define a problem statement and your success metric, the better the outcome. So simply put, idea generation is not innovation. It can be a starting point, but it's quite worthless to the organization without a systemic ability to execute on those ideas. And oftentimes, executives focus on idea generation without the discipline of aligning the ideas to the strategic goals of the company. And in effect, the challenge is more around designing and maintaining the systemic ability to execute on those good ideas. So that's a quote from Scott Anthony, which I think is actually true. The focus really needs to be on execution. And so you might have the greatest idea. It's the way you iterate it and get it to market and manage to nurture it to the point that it becomes a viable outcome. That's the hard problem. It might get a lot more exciting to focus on the idea fest, but actually the bottleneck comes right after that. So some of the things we've been talking about are this notion that one might have the urge to jump into a decomposition and sort of categorize the kind of activities one might do under the umbrella of an innovation initiative, and that it's actually quite hard. And there is a reason for that. The reason is that, as obvious as it may sound, today corporations are complex. And they're not only complex, but they operate in a very complex environment. And so I borrowed this definition of complexity from this book that's on system architecture that's about to come out. But I think it's a very simple one and quite true. And I think if all of you look at how your companies operate, you know, they're complex. There's a very complex value chain. There is partnerships. There are distributed entities with multiple locations, global, and different policies and so on. So that complexity requires a way to think about how to do innovation. And I think we tend to think about those models I showed around, you know, very structured, 7 types, 10 types, and so on, in trying to sort of look at this in a way that might not be managing complexity, but trying to control and exert control. And I think to mobilize a large corporation in order to innovate actually requires managing complexity. So if we go back to my first slide about this idea that we are in more turbulent times with more competitive forces and it's harder to hold on to a leadership position, we might want to think about the benefits of shifting from a control paradigm to a complexity paradigm, and the idea that there is some new ways to think about what are the success factors in being innovative. And I'll talk to some of those specifically around this idea of open and continuous when I touch upon open innovation and the lean startup principles. So one of the useful ideas that I wanted to share here is this idea of systemic innovation. And I think we talked about complexity. So the systemic nature of innovation makes companies increasingly dependent on others. Because in complex systems, innovation, vertical integration is rarely an option, and the innovation processes become increasingly collaborative. And so in systemic innovation, partners and external developer communities make up a significant resource pool working on developing different components of the systemic innovation. And I think one lens that's useful is instead of looking at your innovation strategy as being these various BUs and maybe best case a new venture division, which is what NVD stands for on this slide, start looking at innovation systemically, the entire system. Where are the boundaries of my firm? What are the other important entities that enable me to succeed? And I think that's a really important notion as we're thinking about operating in an increasingly complex world where technology is changing faster, and so there is less an opportunity of figuring it all out and building it all ourselves. And more importantly, thinking about innovation as the proper mechanism to engage with this larger group of people, communities, and complementers that help us build better products. So this is, all these points were sort of leading to why I've been thinking a lot about the role of system architecture and innovation. And this is an area that I've been thinking about. I don't have a perfect prescription, but I think as many companies are experimenting with innovation technique, very few are actually thinking about new decision tools. So in other words, they're putting processes in place to do innovation without putting in place the tools to make better decisions. And I think system architecture is a set of principles to help you make better decisions at the onset, at the design stage of something like an innovation initiative. So systemic innovation versus autonomous innovation, innovations that require significant adjustment in other part of the business system that they are embedded in. And as I mentioned, due to the fact that systemic innovations in processes frequently span beyond the boundaries of the firm, they often entail the coordination of different parts of the value network and entail open innovation organization models of innovation activities. So this is a quote that comes from Henry Chesborough's book on open innovation, researching a new paradigm. And, you know, I found it quite striking that it actually connects this notion of system architecture with innovation, and he describes not innovation leaders, but innovation architects. And I thought that made a lot of sense because in the concept we just described, there is an importance in managing complexity, which is a task of a system architect. And there is a need to think holistically about a system that is the firm and its partners and its complementers and so on, and how to go to market in a way that actually, again, aligns with this notion of being a system architect. And I think more importantly, when you start an initiative, it's important to think where you're headed. So oftentimes, and one lens that I found useful was to think about a pilot, something you test out and can rapidly iterate around, to establishing perhaps a capability, my ability to crowdsource within my organization, my ability to, better partner with the startup community to start understanding what's happening in that space. But I think when you combine focus, a commitment, and this idea of being able to work more openly, then you start migrating from an initiative that's a pilot to a capability to becoming systemic in your organization. So, in short, I think here I wanted to just take a few words on why system architecture. Because like I said, in systemic innovation, industry leaders play this role of architects. That the role of a system architect is to reduce ambiguity, apply creativity, and manage complexity. It sounds like an element of innovation. That focus is incredibly important in system architecture. I think it's absolutely essential when running innovation initiatives. And that architecture is a way to start thinking holistically and planning for things like unintended consequences of your engagement model with employees, for instance, and just thinking really hard about emergent behaviors of your approach. And as we mentioned at the very beginning, the importance of thinking very carefully about the way you're going to decompose your approach to innovation. So, because innovation initiatives necessarily touch many parts of the enterprise, managing innovation requires this holistic approach. And, we're talking here about this concept that's part of the program here, system design management, is this notion of system thinking, which grew out of aerospace application, where performance at the edge of the envelope created a need for complex problem solving. I think that is clearly applicable in environments where innovation is a way to increase performance of the firm, to get somewhere further than business as usual. And I think system thinking recognizes the implication of this early decision made when launching this innovation initiative, taking into account all these downstream consequences. So I attempted to make the case for the usefulness of some of the notions and tools from system architecture and setting up an innovation initiative. What I'd like to do now is talk to you about a couple of aspects or ways of thinking about innovation that might be helpful to you. And those are things that I've built as pilots, and now we're turning into capability, thinking about that sort of maturity curve. And the first one, to shift gear here is a little bit, is around open innovation. So, what is open innovation? Well, what it's not is a suggestion box. It's not about capturing more ideas. Those are important tools to listen to the crowd and they serve a purpose, but they aren't the same as open, challenge-driven innovation, or open innovation with very clear rules of engagement with the outside community. It's about focusing on solving a problem. So one example might be the Netflix prize, for instance. So here's an example, and I think we touched enough on it earlier, but you have to understand what you get when you don't do the focus. When you're not engaging the entities in the open community, you'll get too much noise. And maybe you do get brand awareness, if that's what you were looking for. But if you look at this IdeaStorm, there's about 2.6% implementation rate. And again, we talked about why that might happen, but that's what I think gets confused with running innovation and idea generation, is that open innovation, in my mind, is better executed with focus and well-defined problem statement and well-bounded conditions. So that's how it might be different. First, understand that not every challenge or every call for action is going to be successful. I think having realistic expectation of success rate is critically helpful. The other is to think about it in terms of calling for problems and mobilizing a crowd or mobilizing partners to solve that problem. So you might discover a new solution from your employees, your customers, some expert crowds, from your technical partners. So this is an example of a few things we did with the web of knowledge, we ran an external challenge by opening up our APIs around data visualization of author relationships. And we set up a very clear problem on, we wanted to understand how one might consume that data differently, and what we were looking for was around author relationships. We've run a couple of different ones around understanding, for instance, how we might think about applying big data technologies in serving better our customer in our legal division. And in some cases, we used it to gather requirements, for instance, and better connect internal customer to a central function that delivers a cloud capability, for instance. And so the idea is to be asking a clear problem and mobilizing a solver community around it. And it doesn't have to be a crowd only. You can actually think, as we talked about in the systemic innovation framework, of an environment which includes your internal team, where you need concentrated technical expertise and solution expertise, all the way from a more distributed model. And in that framework, you think about partnering with startups on one time horizon and research institutions on another one. And you basically think of this solver community and networks in a broader sense. So I think, to summarize here, the notions of systemic innovation and open innovation are intertwined and connected. Open simply means that you are looking outside of the boundary of the firm. To go to market, a lot of products require, especially in my space, thinking about how to partner better, how to go to market better, and there isn't the luxury of waiting to identify the emergent solution. You need to find a way to identify sort of the right approaches with the ability to do that search more effectively. So open is one aspect of it. The other is some principles that go through this sort of name of lean startup. And they originally were defined in a book by Eric Ries for how startups can better understand how to go to market. Those principles have been applied in some instances in large corporations. One notable example is Intuit. And why is that? So that's because you cannot wait for the emergence of essential complementarity, and you want to conduct an effective search, and also because you want to diffuse risk, gain knowledge of the market, and better select your complementors. So what does this really mean? It's really about good decision-making in fast-paced environments, and it's really, again, relinquishing the myth of free-flowing creativity, and companies seeking new ways to innovate often get stuck on this idea to make their employees more creative, where really the value would be on being able to make faster, better decisions. And so one way to do this is to look at developing systematic innovation techniques, here lean or variant of lean, specified for the early stages or R&D. So let's talk a little bit about it. So the idea is that you have a hypothesis, you build something that we call a minimal viable product, that at the onset of setting up the hypothesis, you define what your measurable is, you collect the data, and then you learn, and you feed that learning into the next stage. So it's this rapid iteration model that's very much data-driven, very much hypothesis-driven, and I think this is where big data technologies are enabling a new way of functioning, because it's easier to collect data about your products, especially if it's a network product or a web product or a mobile app, and enables you to run some hypothesis testing and data-driven experiments to do this sort of loops, basically, which is the model of the lean startup. And so the benefit from a large global enterprise to adopt such a model or to give it a shot is the rapid cycle experimentation with data-driven decision-making is a good response to market uncertainty and competitive pressure. And so I think to kind of summarize, those are just tools that you might consider if you're in an environment where you're thinking you're looking at increased complexity, that you're thinking about going to market no longer is something you're doing solely on your own in a highly verticalized structure, then most likely you're looking at a lot of interdependency in your value chain, and you're looking for ways to quickly identify value from your innovation initiative. That rapid cycle helps you really de-risk the process. So one of the ways we apply this model has been to engage with partner startups, and we bring them in a measurable, several months, well-defined cycle, and we agree on what the proof of concept with their technology or their value proposition might look like, agree on success metrics, go ahead and collaborate and co-create on a proof of concept, look at that minimum viable product with a customer or internal or external, and then figure out how we did against that metric. And that data translates into the next phase. If we hit the metrics, then we move on to a next iteration, or the learning might help us redirect what's the right question, what right hypothesis. By doing this iterative process, you move on in better understanding the value proposition from an innovator in the market. And we're also clear on what success looks like, and look at sort of investments that are well-defined, well-bounded, and help sort of push through some of the uncertainty that might be created in a new area by new technologies, for instance. So the last thing I wanted to do is share some references that might be helpful in this broad stroke brush I just painted, and hope that might be helpful for you. So one is a forthcoming book, which I had the privilege of reading a draft and referencing through this presentation, coming out of MIT on system architecture, technology strategy, and product development. And I'd like to thank Bruce for connecting me with this material. And having taken Professor Crawley's class, I think those concepts end up becoming part of the way you think, and end up being quite helpful in thinking about your work, in this case, in managing corporate innovation. The two other references I'd like to share, one is Lean Analytics. The book is largely set up for startups, although I found that the principles have been quite helpful in thinking about corporate innovation. And some of my colleagues leading business units have actually shared the book with the entire management team as a way to think about this new era of data-driven decision-making and the implication in management, and specifically in thinking about becoming more innovative. And the last, which is a little old, but I think there is a really great chapter 12 on systemic innovation, is by Henry Chesbrough and other authors, Open Innovation, Researching a New Paradigm. And I think that it does a really good job in describing why innovation is now something that one must think about holistically, and how to connect the notions of open innovation with managing a complex set of stakeholders. Thank you. These are my contact information. Feel free to reach out to me, and I'm going to open up, I guess, for questions.
Mona, thank you very, very much. Folks, this is the time for you to enter any questions you have for Mona directly into the chat section. Please address them to everyone. And while that is happening, let me just remind you that we will be sending an email follow-up to this presentation by the end of the week. It will contain links to the webinar recording, to the presentation slides, and to Mona Vernon's contact information. We have a question from Miguel Stewart, which is, are there any studies in systemic innovation that have proven successful in the IT, government, or large-scale nonprofit organizational systems?
That's a very good question. So one caveat with this notion of systemic innovation is that that whole chapter in Chesbrough's book called for a lot of future research, and there is, largely speaking, very little documented on success metrics However, again, because of that caveman effect I mentioned, is true for any kind of initiative. One of the things that I am seeing more is, as you might know, in the government space, is a rise of this open data movement and trying to organize open innovation challenges around the open data. I don't have data on how that's panning out. I think it's quite early on, and again, one of the reasons I'm doing this talk is to encourage more transparencies about the outcomes, which is unfortunately lacking.
Thank you, Mona. And Miguel, you and others might be interested in attending next week's webinar on the 21st of July. It is on system architecture and the evolution of e-governance in the Republic of Estonia and the lessons it has for industries around the world. The presenter will be Andres Kut, who is the head software architect in the Republic of Estonia and the former chief evangelist for Skype. And of course, he's an SDM alum as well. We have a question now from, let's see, Anand Sakarapuram. I can't even begin to pronounce your last name, so please accept my apologies. In today's corporate context, most areas seem to have short-term focus. How do we focus on innovation in such a scenario?
Very good question. So the notion of systemic innovation and understanding includes managing on different time horizons. And I think about building a portfolio where you're looking at long-term trajectory and de-risking those with research institutions like academics, being able to kind of look ahead of the pace of technological innovation with startups where there is more risk being taken, and in some sense partnering with them helps you look a little further ahead. So this managing against time horizons is absolutely critical, indeed very difficult to do. And I think one of the reasons you want to be very crisp about what cannot be achieved with short-term techniques like, collecting ideas and figuring out how to turn those into revenue is recognizing the importance of managing across various time horizons. It is a challenge. I don't know how people successfully tackle it, but to recognize the importance of the different time horizons.
Okay, thank you. Now we have a question from Paul Davis, which is, in a decomposition mode, you can lose the forest for the trees. Is there any recommendation for reintegrating innovation into the solution space to keep on the lean path?
Yes, so that's an excellent question. I wish I had that type of questions more often. This is a great audience. That's a very good question. So I want to go to this slide real quick. If you think of your initiative as basically starting, let's say, with a pilot, and at that stage you're doing a decomposition, then the approach I've taken is to be very clear about the metrics, success metrics of the pilot, and rapidly iterate so that the learnings are incorporated in that pilot phase before you move on. And it does require looking at the metrics, asking if they're the right metrics, what happens when learning comes in terms of your original scope, and having that flexibility. It might actually look confusing to traditional control-centric organization because it might look like you're changing your mind, but actually what you're doing is refining and integrating the learning and having a new appreciation of what the forest actually looks like. So one of the most useful tools in that pilot phase of your innovation initiative is to apply the data-driven rapid cycle experimentation and contrast that with this holistic view. So to me, the lacking, you have to put together the lean startup approach with this holistic thinking, the system thinking. They have to go together so that you can effectively move forward.
Great. Thank you, Mona. We have a few more minutes if anyone else would like to ask a question. Or Mona, or if there's something you'd like to add.
I'm good. Thank you. That was very great questions. Thank you.
Okay. So, thank you all for attending. Again, we're having a webinar a week from today on the 21st, and we hope you'll be able to join us. There will be a link in the follow-up email that we'll be sending you to Mona's slide presentation and recording. Mona, on behalf of SDM, thank you very much. This has been a dynamite webinar. And as I said earlier, before we started recording, you are invited back anytime. Thanks, everyone. Hope to see you next week.
Thank you.